As we finish off our timeline, it's going to be a little bit different in that I'm going to have you do the research to find the sample texts. I'll show you what I mean by that in just a moment. I want to remind you that recently we studied and picked up realism, mid-1800s, things like Huck Finn, money, hardship, poverty, racism, real people, real dialects. And then down here we had naturalism, where we got into the gruesome and grotesque. We read that murder story. Then we had modernism, which was all about World War I, the horrors of war, new sense of feminism, artists now seen as kind of misfit on the fringes of society. So what do you do after modernism? Isn't modernism about as modern as you can get? Well, they decided that the World War II era they would call postmodernism, which really cracks me up. Postmodernism, I love it. Okay, so World War II era, all right, things are still angsty and troubled. One thing that they came up with was the new genre called existentialism. Let's see, watch our spelling on this. First you have to exist. You do it in a tent. Existentialism. Existentialism. Defined as, we use that word, are you having an existential crisis? Meaning, are you having an identity crisis? Finding identity, purpose in an absurd world. So we saw the start of that as establishments over here in modernism, religion, governments are starting to fail us. Now, life is just so crazy and it makes no sense. How can we find love and happiness, and how can we even figure out who we are? There's a real bleak tone to existentialism. Nothing we do matters, and then we die in the end kind of a feel. Okay? One of the famous books from that time period was called The Stranger, by a guy named Albert, looks like Camus. In French he was pronounced Albert Camus. And The Stranger is all about a guy whose mother dies, but he doesn't seem to really notice or care. He kind of follows a woman around for a while, and then randomly he's on a beach one day and he kills a guy, and when he goes to trial he cannot think of a reason. There really was no reason. It was arbitrary. And then the book ends, random and depressing kind of things. Now guys, I want you to look up and get me 2 more examples of famous existential pieces. I want you to do the research. I think it will help solidify in your brain some of these things, because we're not going to have a test on this, so I don't want to just rush through it, give you all the answers. I want you to think about it a little bit. So I think this will be a good way to do it. Okay, I'm going to have you find the sample texts. All right. What I would do is just Google famous books of existentialism to get those 2. A subgenre of this particular genre is theater of the absurd. And in theater of the absurd, nothing really happens, but they sure talk a lot. There's a weird one that the IB seniors read called Waiting for Godot, which is a little wordplay on waiting for God. These 2 characters, Vladimir and Estragon, are just on the stage. They talk, nothing happens, and Godot never comes. There's a weird one called Bald Soprano, where these people start to act like children, and then their language degenerates to almost animalistic talk, and then they stop being able to talk altogether, proving that language systems are irrational and weird, and it doesn't really work. Yeah, really strange stuff. Okay, the second one that is postmodern is stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness. And this is where people tried to imitate exactly how people think, writing long, rambling, tangential sentences that go on and on and on. It's kind of a gimmick, and it's a little hard to read. Sometimes stream of conscious pieces, you have to read it and then you piece together what actually happened. It's almost like a puzzle sort of thing. Okay, I can't resist. I'm going to give you the most famous stream of consciousness one, but then you've got to look up the rest. The most famous one is Ulysses by James Joyce. The whole thing is not written. This is a huge novel, and it's based on Odysseus, except it's this guy's 2 days in Dublin just hanging out. But almost every chapter has some other gimmick or some unique thing that it does, and he employs a lot of stream of consciousness. This book right here wins the world's prize for having the longest published sentence. It goes on and on and on. I mean, it's a run-on. It's not a real sentence. But the longest published thing before a period is there. So please look up 2 other, famous examples of stream of consciousness. Now, this guy actually belongs in the 1950s. So let me go over here, and then we'll work down and get to that. Okay? So postmodernism ends, life slows down a little bit, and when life gets more pleasant, people start to have a little more fun, and they start to go back to escapist kinds of literature that's not so serious and identity crisis and things like that. So by the 1950s, we're going to have some fun again. Okay? For example, we get fantasy. That whole genre of elves and wizards and gnomes that we take for granted. I mean, it's so common now, right? Really, it didn't exist until Tolkien in the 1950s did Lord of the Rings. He was the first to create a brand new world, people it, give it languages. So even if you don't like it, give him credit for really promoting it. And then fantasy has exploded since then. But to think, 1950s, that's really not that long ago, about 70 years. Okay? Way, way back in ancient times, in mythological times, when they had creation mythology and epics, you would get the supernatural like that, demons and dragons and witches. But since then, we didn't do fantasy, okay? Now, underneath it, you have this thing called high fantasy. That means that it's a completely new world. It opens with a map. The best books open with a map, right? You're in a new world. You don't know what cultures and peoples and beings you're going to get. Low fantasy means our world with magic. So even Harry Potter counts as a low fantasy because we're all muggles. Okay, please look up 3 famous examples of fantasy. Down here, we get magical realism. That sounds interesting. This is a very unique one that you probably haven't heard of. It was invented by Latino authors, so let's put Hispanic in origin, although other people have used it since then. The thing about magical realism, again, we're in pretty gritty, harsh, real worlds. They tend to be quite epic in terms of deep family drama kinds of things. And there are, it's not always religious, but it's often quasi-religious kinds of magic, and I'm going to use the word miracles. And with magical realism, you don't really know if the magic really happened or not. It's so odd. So I'm going to have you read a story to just show you what magical realism is. It's called The Old Man with Enormous Wings. Is he an angel? Is he not? Can he fly? Can't he? Magical realism tends to be long and family dramas, like generations and generations go by of family drama, illegitimate children, abuse. It's pretty heavy stuff. But then there are these elements of, did the old man who's dying really see a river of blood running down the street, or did he hallucinate it? And at the same time, did his son-in-law actually get smothered to death by a swarm of butterflies? Was that a magical thing that happened? It's very odd. Yeah, cool, huh? Okay, down here we get a fun group called the Beatniks, if you like this sort of thing. The Beatniks. Now, guys, this was about sex and drugs. Okay? The Beatniks were experimental with sex and drugs, free love, smoking, and doing whatever, and writing down their experiences. But most of what they did, they set to poetry or books. And then these guys kind of morphed into the 1970s to become the hippies. But the hippies tended to put their words to music. Okay? The beatniks were definitely written word. Sex and drugs, sex and drugs. So look up, famous beatnik books or famous beatnik authors. Okay? And then we had the 1950s brought us fantasy. What happened to sci-fi? Yes, same thing. See, we're in this mode of escapist kind of stuff. So yes, we start to get science fiction. Now there had been a few before the 1950s. War of the Worlds in like the 1920s, I think. But it was the 1950s where it really took off. Hard sci-fi, the science really matters. Hard sci-fi is written by scientists who know their stuff. And even if the science doesn't really work, it's plausible enough that it could. The science matters. Soft sci-fi, the people end up in Alpha Centauri. Who cares how they got there, how their engines actually work. It's more character-driven, story-driven. We'll say soft sci-fi is story matters more. Okay. All right, getting closer. All right, we've got a little thing in here where it says 2 things happened in the 1980s. I've been born by now. I was born in 1975. So 5 years into my life, what happened? Okay, there's actually not really enough room to write it. But I know. Here's what we'll do. In the 1980s, it was really called performance poetry. But we can just put slam poetry. Was developed. Okay, that hadn't existed until then. And then also, we're missing a big genre that we haven't discussed yet. And it really didn't happen until the 1980s. Horror. Stephen King, Dean Koontz. Oh my gosh. That Straub fellow. Oof, spooky stuff. Okay, in the 1990s then, let's see, 1990s, I'm in high school. Guess what happened? We get paranormal romance. Oh my gosh. There are people in love with each other, but one or more of the people is special. Maybe because they're a vampire, or maybe they're sparkly, or they're dead. Paranormal romance. I actually witnessed the creation of paranormal romance. So before the 1990s, if you went to a bookstore and went to the teen section, it wasn't all black, The book covers weren't all black and angsty looking with roses bleeding and things like that. In fact, they didn't really have an adolescent teen section. But then Stephanie Meyer came along, and you go to the teen section of Barnes & Noble now, and my gosh, black covers and all these weird romances. It's good stuff. Okay, 1990s also brought us steampunk. For steampunk, you have to have clockwork, and usually the clockwork is a lot bigger, big, giant machines kind of things. Like there's a book called The Mortal Engines where these cities are actually floating around on wheels, these giant cities, swallowing up other cities. And Victorian costuming plays a big role. The parasols, the long skirts, the top hats and tails. It's kind of a neat look. There might be some magic concerned with it, so maybe the guy has a clockwork arm, that can do magic a little bit. It's good stuff. And then finally, what's the last genre that's been invented? Ooh, what could it be? I put a little hand dripping blood here. What we get is dystopian fiction that's become all the rage. Zombie apocalypse and post-apocalyptic, people trying to survive. You get Maze Runner, Hunger Games, things like that. Okay, so go ahead and make sure to look at them. So, like for this one, I just look up famous dystopian novels and rate them down. And then once you get 3 for each, post it. That'll be awesome. And I hope you guys have enjoyed learning about the history of our time periods. Have a nice day.